Hello and welcome. I'm Brett Theodos, a senior fellow and director of the Community Economic Development Hub at the Urban Institute, and I'm excited today to introduce a discussion that we're going to be having about using real estate to grow nonprofit sustainability. And we'll be digging into a specific case study here in DC having to do with Whitman Walker. I'll run through a couple of housekeeping, offer a little framing, and then we will get to our panel. So first, the event is getting recorded, and we will put this recording online so that you can share it. We are going to be hiding captions, but you adjust that setting in your Zoom features. We have speaker bios available at urban.org. All participants will be muted through the duration of the event, but we do want to hear from you. So please put your questions or comments in the Q&A box at any time, and we will have a dedicated time where we are going to be working those in to the discussion. And lastly, we want to know how we can improve our events, so please complete a survey that you will get at the end. Okay, a couple of minutes of framing. So we know that community serving nonprofits play a really important role in neighborhoods, in areas of education, in arts, in culture, in health, youth, housing, and so very many spaces. But we also know that keeping the lights on can be a real challenge, and there are always constraints on funding available for nonprofit operations. And so one underexplored opportunity is actually leveraging, accessing, using the value of land that nonprofits own. Obviously, not every nonprofit owns land, but many do. And in some cases, that land has a lot of value attached to it. So nonprofits with land holdings, they can face pressures as neighborhoods appreciate around them, whether they cash in on those holdings or try to hang on. But we are lifting up a case study, an example of a different path, redeveloping land into a revenue generating asset for a nonprofit. So with that brief intro, we are going to pass this over to my colleague, Rebecca Marks. And Rebecca and I and our colleague, Thane, have drafted a brief that we're releasing today that details many more of the specifics of the Whitman Walker development. But Rebecca is going to moderate our first panel to get both the nonprofit and the developer perspectives. And then I'll come back in the second half of this hour and moderate our panel, another fireside chat as we think about how we can move from this case study towards replication and models in other places and markets. So with that, I'll pass it over to Rebecca. Thanks.
Thanks, Brett. As Brett mentioned, I had the pleasure of working with him and Thane to document the details of the joint venture between Whitman Walker and Fivesquares to redevelop the Elizabeth Taylor Medical Center, colloquially referred to as Liz. So today I'm happy to introduce Naseema Shafi, Chief Executive Officer at Whitman Walker, and Andy Altman, Principal and Co-founder at Fivesquares Development, who are here to talk about the why, what, and how of this creative joint venture. And if you both would like to put your videos on, I'm told we have about 21 minutes to get through all this fascinating content and address audience questions, so we'll just hop right in. And I'll start by turning to Naseema. Naseema, can you briefly share who and what Whitman Walker is organizationally, and where Whitman Walker found itself prior to this redevelopment? Why was Whitman Walker interested in thinking outside of the box?
I'd be happy to. Thanks so much for having me, Rebecca. It's a joy to be with everyone here today. So Whitman Walker is a community-based health research and policy organization here in Washington, D.C. We're actually celebrating our 50th anniversary of service to the community this year. So we're looking pretty good at 50. We're pretty proud of that anniversary. And we provide healthcare services to about 20,000 unique individuals in the city. We come up out of a civil rights and social justice movement and out of really the needs to support the LGBT community And similar movements happened across the country. And at the time when we organized in 1973, we were really focused on specific areas of care and services in the community until the AIDS epidemic really changed the course of our future. So fast forwarding quite a number of years to where we were when we were thinking about this redevelopment opportunity and the use of this incredible asset here on 14th Street was that we had just opened a new clinical site on 14th Street. So we moved the majority of our care and services to 1525 14th. And it opened up an opportunity for the board and management to think about this piece of real estate, the old Elizabeth Taylor Medical Center, and future use. And it really was an incredible moment because, in part, the organization wasn't in financial crisis, so had opportunity to think about future with a lot more forward thinking and vision, and really try to find the right fit, going through a really long and iterative process with our boards and management.
Thanks, Nasima, for that introduction. And you referenced the financial crisis that we expect many NGOs face. So with that, we want to turn to the details of the project. And I would like to ask you, Andy, could you account for some of the specifics of the deal and give us an overview of the timing and financing process for this joint venture? And in your opinion, from the developer perspective, what was innovative about this deal?
And how much time do we have, did you say? No. Great. Well, I'll try to, there's a lot there. And I think one of the things that maybe we'll come back to Nasima that I think is really interesting for nonprofits is the selection process they went through, because that's, I think, really leading up to us. The story before us, truthfully, is a really interesting and instructive story, but I'll start the story from when we were selected and let Nasima tell the other part of that. So, we were very fortunate to have been asked among many for-profit developers after the board had decided they want a development partner to put forward a response to a request for proposals. From a real estate developer, this was a tremendous property. It's a tremendous location. 14th and R is, kind of the center of one of the most vibrant corridors in Washington, D.C. For those who aren't from Washington, D.C., I mean, it is, there's nightlife, there are restaurants. It's a corridor that's gone through a lot of transformation, some would say a lot of gentrification over time. And yet Whitman Walker is an institution that had a whole block. So many developers were approaching Whitman Walker all the time to buy the site. Many nonprofits simply sold and left because they could get so much value out of that. They decided on a different approach. Again, I'll let Nasima talk about a bit, so we were selected. There was a 2014, they were going through the process. We ultimately were selected in 2014. Although many developers were attracted to this, we had just started our company. I had a long history in Washington, so I was very passionate about this. I've been the planning director under Tony Williams in Washington in the 2000s and saw the turnaround of Washington, and was fortunate to have been a part of it and lived 2 blocks from here. So I was very familiar with it and very passionate with it. But I think, once many developers got into it and realized that they really wanted a true partnership and a true joint venture, it's a very different animal. And because suddenly you really are becoming, as I say, as Nasima knows, a part of their family. They were admitting someone to be a part of their family. And it was a very rigorous process. And many developers didn't want that. They would want a partner, but really someone who's a silent partner, and they don't really want a real partnership in decision making, and they wanted a fundamental partnership, a true joint venture. That actually excited us as opposed to scaring us. We're passionate about this project, as I said, from a long history of knowing it and having worked with the organization in my capacity in the district government, and really welcome that kind of opportunity. We can talk later about the risks of that to a for-profit, because there are many dealing with a nonprofit and nonprofit boards and volatility. But we were selected 2014, documented everything by 2015, had our joint venture structured roughly around that time, and then proceeded to do the development process together. And again, hand in hand, every aspect: selection of architect, going through entitlements, going through financing. That took about 2 years. 2 historic buildings incorporated into a modern building, 165,000 square feet. And we truly, as a friends of ours in the development business said, we went for the PhD in mixed use. We skipped the undergraduate course. We went to the most complicated project you could possibly do, not only 2 historic buildings, ground floor retail. When Whitman Walker wanted a floor of office, added a 2nd floor of office, and then had 4 stories of residential. And so it's 165,000 square feet, 78 residential units, 50,000 square feet of office and ground floor retail. And that's a very exciting and complicated project. We completed it 2019 and stabilized in terms of all the tenants being in and rent flowing by, roughly 2020, which is around the time we then refinanced during a pandemic. Not the best time to do that, but because of the, I think, design and mixed use of this project, we were still able to secure that. So those are the big picture kind of, I can go into any number of details. It's about $125 million project overall. We had one of the largest loans from a local bank, Eagle, which was roughly in the $70 million range. And then what made this interesting was the kind of mix of other equity sources. And I know the next panel will deal with that, but bringing in social impact capital with traditional private equity capital with developer capital and putting all of that together so that ultimately we can create the most financially beneficial structure to really help with Whitman Walker's goal of generating as much cash flow over time to support their mission and operations.
Thanks, Andy. And you mentioned in there forming a real partnership. So staying on the topic of process, I'm wondering, Naseema, if you can describe the process of aligning your organization's goals and what it took to reach an agreement on the terms of the joint venture. And as you do that, could you also explain why it was important for Whitman Walker to be the majority owner in this venture?
Sure, there's a lot in that question too. And I do want to go back a little bit to the process and some of the questions that Andy mentioned that were really unique to us, and give a lot of credit to my predecessor and the boards that there was a lengthy process to even get to the decision to do a joint venture, to then get to the lengthy process to select the right partner. And I think a lot of that is really important for a nonprofit to go through, because through that process, it's important to identify and really get clear on what values matter the most and what are the core business opportunities. That it's a major decision when you're thinking about the future use of real estate. And it really is best suited when it's grounded in those values so that you can you sort of check in with your assumptions as you go through. So we had a really long process and several board meetings and several advisors to come in and provide that support to the board to help them get to the decision to do the joint venture in the first place before, again, selecting our incredible partners. And another question that sort of why Whitman Walker would do something this creative. Whitman Walker is a pretty creative place. The reason that we exist is to solve problems in a highly regulated industry like healthcare for people who have a difficult time accessing it. So it's actually pretty normal for us to try to think outside the box and do those kinds of things. So once we got into the process and got to a place where we were thinking about those values, that decision about being majority owner, again, back to being rooted, the history of Whitman Walker, why we had real estate was because men died from AIDS and they contributed their land to us. And it really was important to the board and to leadership to honor that legacy and to take seriously the opportunity to still have not only physical presence, emotional presence, and thought presence in what was going to happen with the future use. And the best way for us to achieve those goals was to be majority owners. It wasn't purely a financial decision, but of course, the financial part of that decision was really important. But, Andy described this really incredible use and what exists in this building here at Liz. We wanted to be involved in all of those decisions. We thought that it was important to who we are, but to who we serve and to the legacy that we have in the city.
And Andy, do you have anything to add in terms of what made you feel comfortable with Whitman Walker being the majority owner, or challenges you sort of had to face to get to that point?
Yeah, I think a lot was building a relationship. I mean, actually the time that Naseema was describing and that the board and Don Blanchon is on the next panel, really took, it wasn't a quick, and I think this is an important point, because the for nonprofits, where if you're gonna stay and be a part of this, is investing the time. That can be very discouraging on the private side, like this is taking forever, why is it taking so long? But actually for us, we view that positively, because there's a lot of uncertainty on the private side to go with the nonprofit. You have a board that could change, different interests, an executive director comes and goes, volatility of a nonprofit, stability, all of that. And developers like certainty, and that's not what you're getting, right? So you have to get yourself over, how do I deal with that? And part of that is really being comfortable with the relationship and getting to know them. So like I said, it's like being admitted to the family. We spent lots of time together. They got to know us, we got to know them. And actually, after we were selected, we actually moved into the space and spent a year or so before we started construction, really to get to align our values and be together. But that was really, really important to getting comfortable, because you can only, you can document as much as you want, and obviously you document decision-making and everything else, but, we have joint decision-making on everything. So, I mean, everything, right? For developers, from architect selection to refinancing, very few want to put the refinancing of a building or the control of an asset in that kind of uncertainty, but we felt a lot of confidence. And I would say, and also is that Whitman Walker did a tremendous job, because they spent the time having clarity. Really important what your goals are, and to communicate what your goals are, and then to create a structure around it for decision making and collaboration. But fundamentally, it's all about picking the partner, both for the private side and the nonprofit side, and that's where time matters. Documents are very important, but ultimately it's the relationship that matters.
Thanks, Andy. And that's one point we wanted to make clear in the case documentation, is this took a lot of work from many parties, a lot of time, a lot of conversations and compromise, like you mentioned. Naseema, do you, from your perspective, have any uncertainties or challenges to speak to in this process?
I think that there were a lot of uncertainties along the way, but back to the time, we knew all along that we could get to certainty as long as we invested the time with one another, and everything from, what ultimately will we build? And we spent a lot of time, even after, so, the time to decide to do the joint venture, the time to select the partner, and then the time to decide what actually we were building. There was uncertainty even then. And as a nonprofit, we had to make decisions back to those values and those long-term goals about what we were going to do. We could have delivered a very different product to the community than what is here. But that was something that was really important to us, that we have a really sustainable asset for the future of Whitman Walker and the communities that we serve. So those were certainly uncertainties. And frankly, I think the pandemic was a major uncertainty for us. We managed to be in partnership through a really challenging economic time, a really challenging social time. As a prominent building on 14th Street, there were people going down to Lafayette Park to protest and call to action down 14th Street for several days. And so I think, we're very much a part of the community and the society that we're in, and getting through the pandemic as owners of a major asset here collectively was a big challenge, but one that we were able to get through, because, I think this is a group of people who are really creative, and I'm an attorney by trade. So and Andy and I spent some time last night, but I do think that the investment, which was not insignificant, with lawyers to get through documents, poring over documents, getting comfortable with the documents, is really important.
Thank you both for that. And the process you went through to stand this up is incredible in and of itself, but I'd like to turn now to the project's performance and ask you both, how has the project performed financially, and what difference has that made for all the parties? And I'll go to Andy for this.
Well, I'll just say it's performed really well. I'd say it's also a tribute to how the design, not just the physical design that it's a beautiful building, but actually having mixed use and a diversification of uses is actually really helpful, which went a lot into the program design, having office, having retail, having residential, and having made the decision, which was not an easy one. And Naseema, I speak to this, or need to given the time, but we decided that to maximize the cash flow for ultimately Whitman Walker trying to operating cash flow in the long term, to have really high-end luxury housing, which seems counterintuitive for a nonprofit. Why? But it actually made a lot of sense when you looked at the impact analysis of generating as much cash flow to serve the population they would like to serve, and it's done really well. So we have had the highest rents in the corridor. We during the pandemic, we actually went through with 100% occupancy, which was tremendous. We refinanced during the pandemic, very, successfully, obviously not as successfully as we've done it before the pandemic, but still able to refinance at a favorable rate. And so, it's generating, the building is fully occupied, and it's, and it's performing well and flowing, throwing off the cash flow. And so, so it's been a really tremendous model.
Thanks, Andy. And before I turn to Naseema for the same question, I'd just like to remind folks that they can submit questions in the question and answer box. We'd love to turn to those shortly. But over to you, Naseema.
Yeah, I think I agree with Andy. I think we believe that this has performed really well. It's helping us achieve our financial goals. It is an annuity essentially for Whitman Walker and for programming community in the future. And we're thrilled with how it's doing. I couldn't agree more that the mix of what's here, the retail on the ground floor, residential, and the office has made it a really attractive place to be. I think the residents who are here are happy that they live here. It's a credit to the creativity of the program itself, but there's a lot of synergy that exists in the entire building. And it is showing up in the financial results, which is really important for us for sure.
Yeah. So we have a few specific questions coming in through the chat box. One of them is what if you can speak to other occupants who fill the space. So one question is, does Whitman Walker occupy all of the office space, or is there revenue generated from commercial offices as well?
Whitman Walker occupies a floor of the space for office and for some services that are offered here, but pretty small footprint compared to the total 165. Andy, do you want to take who's on the third floor?
Was it? Yeah. So the third floor is the Goethe Institute, which is the German Cultural Institute. And we're very excited about that because part of the vision for 14th Street and also Whitman Walker's vision was that this create a vibrant hub, actually, right? That this is, not only mixed use, but it is the center of 14th Street, which was, as an should be an arts district, meant to be promoted as an arts district. And so very synergistic with the uses that we wanted to create. So Goethe Institute took a floor, Whitman Walker is a floor. Again, that's about 50,000 square feet of office. And then you have the 78 residential units. And then you have ground floor retail, which again is very diversified between, a classic anchor, credit tenant, as they say in retail, of a Sephora, with a small local entrepreneur, Jane, which is a little 1,000 square feet maybe, lounge restaurant. That's one of the most popular places in all the community by two local entrepreneurs who have space. So the idea is really to have this mix and create one of the most beautiful things, right, Naseema, is that you go to this building and it truly is a hub. It's a hub of activity between Whitman Walker, between a Goethe Institute, between having a restaurant, between having retail, cultural, all of this is a tremendous mix. And we created public space at 14th and R, expanded public space where there was none. So it became really what Whitman Walker's vision, and again, back to attribute to the clarity of their vision, that it wasn't just how do you sell off a real estate asset, it's how do you both create value and create a real vibrant center, because they are, one of the most important institutions in this community.
And the outdoor space, Andy just touched on it. It is really, really tremendous that we built together public space. We built together through a lot of creativity, a lot of time, and a lot of flexibility from the city and what are traditional rules. This is a place people stop here, they sit, there's somewhere to be. And that was really important to us, and we were really lucky to deliver that to the community. I do think it's one of the ways that it's built resiliency into this building as well, just that outdoor space itself.
Thank you. And I want to ask one more audience question before we turn to the next panel. Can you both touch on the other stakeholders involved in this joint venture, and to the extent that you're able to share specifics? Some folks are interested in, for example, who the law firm was that you worked with and what the importance was of all these other stakeholders.
I'll start with some of the stakeholders that are important for the nonprofit, and I think this is probably going to be true with any nonprofit going through these decisions. Of course, your board is a major stakeholder. You want to make sure that they're engaged in the process, that they have opportunity to think, and that you really create opportunity for every single board member to weigh in. And when you're sort of a community legacy organization like Whitman Walker, there are other stakeholders around. So to the extent that it's possible to be engaged with those stakeholders and keep them involved and test some concepts with them, whether they're patients or other folks who get services from whatever the nonprofit is, that's really important. And then Whitman Walker used a great attorney team at Venable to represent us through this work. And Andy can share other partners.
Well, you know, it's a tricky part. So just to follow in the law firm, we need Arnold and Porter, who were tremendous, helpful, and the lawyers worked well together. And I think part of that is how they are directed by their clients, right? Which is, how do we problem solve this, not come at this adversarially? So a lot of it stems from, again, back to the relationship. You know, there was a lot in Whitman Walker. This is a real asset that nonprofits have, which is relationships in the community. And so we were able to work, and Nasima and I went to, I don't know how many meetings with our local neighborhood commissions, meeting with people on the street, walking up and down, talking to them about the project. So there was a broad, particularly given Whitman Walker's long relationship, a lot of time and effort spent in the community with those stakeholders. You'll hear specifically in the next panel about, you know, the partners, financial partners. So I'll let them speak to that. But with Whitman Walker allowed the creativity to bring in, you know, philanthropy, which were very, very important to making this whole project successful. So there's stakeholders at many, many levels.
And Andy, just one more question for you. Could you talk about how the innovative public mini park contributes to the value of the project?
Yeah, well, you know, you have to admit bias, right? I'm a city planner, so I obviously believe that there's tremendous value in public space. But having said that, not only philosophically, but I think you can actually, it's been proven, right, that if you have public space, it creates real estate value, right? You can say it's 20%, you can say it's 25%. Numbers vary, but there's just no question that it's empirically true. And I think what it creates is not only that's on the pure value proposition, right? More importantly, I think, is what it created in terms of a sense of community and a sense of a gathering space. You know, when you're on a street like this in Washington, D.C. and other cities where you have very vibrant corridors full of restaurants, the only way people could experience that was to sit in a restaurant and have to, you know, buy a place at the table, right? There was no civic space. These civic spaces are really precious. And I think it was important because, as I said, with Whitman Walker's history and identity in this community and how passionate people are about it, that you come to this corner at 14th and R, there is something special there. And that public space signifies that this is a civic space. It's a welcoming space. I mean, Whitman Walker talks a lot about welcoming communities and people feeling comfortable. Public space is important to that. So it works at a real estate value proposition if you're a private developer. It works at the level of community building and community gathering, and it works because it's important to the overall, I think, health and vitality of a city. And the pandemic has proven the value of these open spaces. People are just out there enjoying them. They can breathe. And so I'll stop because I will go on for another 30 minutes about the value of public space.
Yeah, I think we have time for just one final question. So we'll stay on the kind of the topic of use of space. One question from the audience is, was there pushback and or regulations to build affordable or permanent supporting housing in the project, given where DC and the country is with the affordability crisis?
The building meets the requirements as per code for building affordable units. And so that was really important to us. Of course, we achieved what was required of us in delivering that to the community. And And as we were leasing up those units, they were all done sort of in compliance with what those processes are here locally. I don't know if Andy, if you want to add anything.
No, we have inclusionary zoning in the District of Columbia. And so, so we included those units were included as part of the project. So absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
There weren't, I would say, I mean, if your question, if people ask, was there a lot of pressure on the other side? No, because I think there's a lot of education. Again, Nassima did a huge amount of, Whitman Walker did a huge amount of outreach, and the whole team there to explain what this project was about, because that's an obvious pressure in a community that's experiencing pressures of affordable housing, to explain that the reason we're building what we're building is we're trying to generate, again, maximize the value of this property to create as much, revenue for a nonprofit that's serving the community and vital healthcare needs in this community. And so people understood that proposition. Could I get X more units of affordable housing in the scheme of how many units are needed relative to how much can you do to serve the population in terms of the core business, which is important for nonprofits. What is your core business? Do you want to go into the housing business and maybe have 70 units of housing, or do you want to serve hundreds and hundreds of people? And we, I didn't do this. Nassima and Don and others did this extremely well in anticipation of that, but for people to understand what this was all about.
Great. Thank you so much both for this fantastic conversation. Nassima and Andy will be welcomed back at the end of the chat for more questions. So keep them flowing, and I'll welcome back Brett to lead the next conversation.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Nassima. Thanks, Andy. So we are gonna bring up our second fireside chat here. So if Don and Dan can join. So by way of brief introduction, and you all can share more of your particular roles and experience along the way, but Dan is with Emerson Collective, so a funder in this space, and Don was on something of the hot seat here. He was former CEO of Whitman Walker Health System. So let's jump in to discussing this project. Also, we have been getting a bunch of questions about the timing as well as about the financing structure. So if there's time, we'll circle back to that at the end, but I will say that we have a couple of really nice figures in the brief that show the capital stack and show the timelines. So go there and check that out as well. But while we have the benefit of having Don and Dan with us, let's start. So you heard about what this thing was in the first panel. The second panel is really focusing on implications for the field and where we go from here. So let's start with a question on what made this project successful. So we've heard it's generating financial return for a community health serving organization. It's performing financially. What are the ingredients for success in the project that other people need to make sure they include if they're going to be thinking about doing something similar?
So before we do that, if you don't mind, Brett, what I'd like to say is the Emerson Collective is a social impact organization. We're focused on eliminating barriers for people reaching their full potential. And you described us as kind of a funder in this area. We're more of an experimenter in this area. We're really trying to work with social entrepreneurs like Don and Nassima and their organizations to really explore the realm of what's possible so that they can actually build a path to sustainability that doesn't rely so heavily or as predominantly on fundraising. The idea of helping them build a business model, leveraging the assets they have so that they can create a stream of revenue then that supports their incredible program, what they do in the community, that seems like a real kind of meaningful form of social investment and impact investment. And so for us, our real interest was to explore this idea that Don and his board had worked through of being a joint development partner and seeing if there was some way that philanthropy could actually increase then the potential benefit to the nonprofit as a result of it. So I think that is a long way of coming back around to your question. What are some of the preconditions? And some of the preconditions are an organization that really understand what its value proposition is to the community, what it is it's trying to deliver to the community. Don can talk a little bit about how that was evolving for Whitman Walker. The geography was evolving for them. And then, in this instance, the presence of a very valuable asset. And then I would say the forethought to say, well, let's not just sell it. Let's see if we can leverage it in a way to generate long-term beneficial value to the organization and ultimately to the people they serve.
So Brett, it's great to see you. Dan, as always, I enjoy time with you. I want to give a nod to Naseema and Andy, who made this project happen over what now is about a decade of work from inception to this webinar today. I'm Don Blanch and I'm the CEO of Fivesquares Advisors. I had the joy of leading Whitman Walker for almost 16 years. And I view this project as one of the most interesting and creative things we did to try to advance our mission. And it sounds really quirky because it's a creative, in effect, real estate financing deal, but it has more impact probably over the long term than many of the programs we offer. And I can come back and answer some of that in the Q&A. I think the thing that Andy and Naseema touched on significantly that I want to underscore is, there needs to be a clarity of purpose. There needs to be clarity of values, and there needs to be alignment of interests. And when I think about kind of how this thing worked, and it can work in different iterations in different communities across the US, what the secret sauce at Whitman Walker was understanding exactly what the board was trying to accomplish. And so it wasn't to sell to generate capital for new programming solely in the short term. It wasn't to create an endowment. It was literally looking at a scenario where in 2008 and 2009, we'd gone through major financial difficulties, including a set of layoffs. 3 years later, had to respond to the Affordable Care Act and the pressure of growing patient base and the need for updated facilities. Then, as Naseema mentioned, moving into a new lease building 3 blocks south on 14th Street, and then having this really amazing asset, which is basically a function of a set of bequests from gay men that died of AIDS. And so we had this significant stewardship element that kind of transcended any immediate need. And so the clarity of purpose for us at the end of the day landed at financial sustainability. It wasn't capital for a new building. It wasn't solely for new programs, and it wasn't about setting up an endowment. It was about, we never want to go back to where we were in 2008 and 2009. And we also have this obligation to serve more people in community. And we had a significant dream, which is to expand east of the Anacostia River at St. Elizabeth's. And so all of those things played in. The second area, which is kind of the clarity of values, we were always at Whitman Walker about affirmation, dignity, and respect. And every time we dealt with any person, stakeholder, government official, you name it, we started from affirmation, dignity, and respect. And those were core values through the entire project. And then finally, the alignment of interests. I mean, you have a lot of different stakeholders in a project of this size over the years. And so you really have to remember what your values are and then work to find compromise. And compromise ultimately is about trust and transparency of information and what you're trying to accomplish. And Andy can speak to this with his partner, Ron Kaplan. We didn't always see eye to eye as Whitman Walker and Fivesquares. We didn't. And so we had to work through that. And for me, I had, as the CEO of Whitman Walker Health, then I had the joy of working with Dan and Emerson Collective and another regional foundation in Washington, D.C. And they weren't quote unquote funders or investors. They were my advisors. They were Whitman Walker partners in this project. And that, to Dan's comments about fueling innovation and trying to find something in a new and creative way to expand impact in community, I was grateful for that support. But for me, clarity of purpose, alignment of interests, these are the core things that you have to do to make a project like this work.
Terrific. Thank you both. And I think it shows both the potential of the model and why we're having a webinar on it, because it's not done every single day, every single place. So you've been through this. Don, you're doing consulting to help other groups think about this. Dan, I know you're engaged in lots of conversations about how to leverage real estate for building wealth and equity. Thinking back through this specific project, what you know now, what would you have done differently? What could have been made easier? What would you have seen? Hindsight's 2020. We got there. This thing's working. So, but still, what would you lift up for those on the webinar?
Well, I have an answer, but I'd like to hear Don's first.
Thanks for putting me on the spot, Dan. I think I won't tie this to the board. I'll tie it to my judgment as the leader at that time, which is I made a mistake of not including as some key advisors a couple of philanthropic groups, including Emerson Collective earlier. And Andy and others were smart enough to raise this perspective. But we did not time their entry in what I consider to be the most beneficial way. And when I look back at the capital stack that is outlined in the brief, I always twitch a little bit about the private equity money that, quite frankly, came in at modest to high interest rates, which, had we done this sooner and thought about it, the practical reality of it is a lot of nonprofits are doing these types of projects in an iterative manner, and new information and new things are happening. And so trying to create a process where you can real-time adjust is important. And so the discipline of managing a process like this is important. But the first one that always I kind of kick myself a little bit about is not bringing the social investors in earlier into how we finalize that capital stack. Because quite frankly, I won't put Dan's group on the spot, but I think we could have gotten a lot more capital to lower our need for that private equity money. And that would have saved hundreds of thousands of dollars on the project.
And I think that's actually pretty much the same answer. And I'm not saying, again, that it's Emerson, but every nonprofit probably has some very, very key continuing contributors, continuing donors, and in many ways, social entrepreneurial investors. I think coming back to them and saying, hey, here's something that's other than a negative 100% return proposal, that we could use some additional capital up front invested in a project that could, in theory, be returned in part. That's a matter of structuring. Thinking in terms of philanthropic capital as not simply grants, but the possibility of PRIs or mission-related investments, MRIs, what Darren Walker at Ford calls MRIs, exploring that as a potential capital source for repositioning assets to generate long-term value is a tremendous benefit to the funder as well, because the funder struggles every year, like, can I keep this going? And the social impact organization struggles every year, wondering, are they going to keep this going? And so the question is, can you structure some of that involvement in a way that actually, as this project has, keeps it going for ultimately the Whitman Walker? So that's the question. But I can't really fault Don, because it wasn't really an idea that was squarely on the table until later. But as he said, having the private equity in the deal, it gave you a sense of the value of the deal, gave you a sense of the risk. It was super useful for understanding the pricing of the difference between our social impact and the market. But having the ability to maybe change the nature of how much private equity was in the deal, structuring it with an assumption that maybe possibly more social impact capital could come in, would be something you'd want to try to do it earlier on.
Hey, Brett, I just want to add one thing to Dan's comments. I don't want to disparage the private equity market or the firm in this. That's not it. It was our decision-making and timing that didn't align well. But I will tell you, having the capital stack and having Whitman Walker, Fivesquares, 2 social investors, and a private equity entity basically transformed this into a nonprofit project, into a commercial venture that had a higher bar around discipline and analysis and, quite frankly, transparency of financial risk and benefits that I quite frankly enjoyed, because it lent itself to clarity of decision making.
Just picking up one question we got in the chat, and another plug to put your questions in the chat if you got them. But somebody asked, is there a capital fund, maintenance fund, reserve? This is a mixed-use real estate project operating as mixed-use real estate projects work in those regards. Anything you want to add there as well, Don?
So, with respect to the project, I'll defer to Andy because he's the firm. Fivesquares has been the managing partner. It had a setup for its own reserves for maintenance, repairs, and all of those things within the annual operating budget. But Andy can speak to that on a much greater detail.
One more quick.
But if you don't mind, if I jump in real quickly at a higher level, though, that's the whole point of this structure, is to recognize that social impact organizations are really good at their social impact. So Whitman Walker is incredible at delivering healthcare to communities that traditionally haven't had access to healthcare. They've been a leader in that. What they're not a leader at is development. And even, Don might argue that historically, even property management. So finding a high quality professional development partner who's gonna own the development and then own the operation and have an aligned interest. That alignment of interest is such a key phrase. Their long-term success, their financial success comes from the financial success of the project. So they want to deliver that for Whitman Walker, who in essence becomes an investment partner. So I think that's the quick answer to that question is, well, that's what we have them for. And it's really not teaching Whitman Walker how to be a brilliant developer. There are plenty of those out there. It's really freeing up Whitman Walker to be a brilliant healthcare.
Yeah, helpful. One more quick side question, and then we'll get back to our thinking about the broader field. But quickly, there was a question here about DC government. And so maybe you could talk briefly about the specifics of how, and also how not the local government was involved, but also if you could think a little bit more generally to the next project on the block, or even the next city, how is it that local government could be involved regardless of how they were here?
Brett, I'm happy to share. I used earlier the term partnership, and that extended obviously to the government officials. And if you think, and the brief does a great job of covering this, Whitman Walker has a 30,000 ground square foot parcel of land in the heart of one of the most desirable commercial corridors in Washington, D.C. And it's not being taxed and hasn't been taxed for years. And we're struggling as a nonprofit to keep it up well. And quite frankly, we have other needs from a mission perspective. And so we had some really interesting kind of what I call quiet behind the scenes conversations with what the city was looking for from us long term. And quite frankly, the need to expand east of the Anacostia River and to address some of the health and racial inequities and care for Black and Brown individuals and families. That was the priority that they had. And so they were going to extend to us some latitude in what we do on 14th Street, because they knew that our strategic push was to go to a place where they wanted more healthcare infrastructure. So they were very open and very creative. We didn't get into any kind of public debate about the space, because we privately held a communication model, which we just informally kept them apprised of our iterative process. And so I think that's one of the lessons that comes out of this, which is you have so many people who have a sense of ownership over a nonprofit that you're going to have to spend a significant amount of time with people, bringing them along, listening, and then having some emotional intelligence about where you're stepping on something and how you're going to respond to that.
Yeah, it's conceivable that the model could evolve in a different instance to include public subsidy. I think what's really interesting here is that this was at its core a basic commercial transaction. Whitman Walker could have sold the property. There's some mention of another nonprofit that essentially did. They sold it and they moved on. What I think is really laudable about this approach is that Whitman Walker didn't sell the property. What they said is, we're continuing our investment here. This is where we started. This is where we've grown. But we're going to leverage the value, some of the value that's been created here, so that we can jump into the communities where we really need it now, and where most of our client base is, so that we can continue to serve our core mission, not serve the original geography. And I think that that's one of the interesting ideas, is this sense of empowering social impact organizations to leverage their assets in partnership, private, philanthropic, and ultimately, hopefully the city, but not waiting for, not necessarily waiting for the leadership to come to the city, from the city. That's not why the social impact organization started to begin with. They didn't wait for the city to start Whitman Walker. In fact, Whitman Walker had to start itself in many ways because public services weren't being given to their client base.
Great. So the city could be a development partner in some of the normal ways. It could provide subsidy in some markets. And I'll lift up a new, very emerging thing that Ben McAdams and others are doing, is actually the city, for city-owned land, could do something parallel to what happened here.
100%. The city doesn't necessarily have to always sell its land or even lease it. They could be a development partner, and there are examples worldwide of cities retaining some ownership interest, and then perhaps using that to buy more affordability, to take the revenue to invest in schools. There's interesting, the idea is to create something other than the traditional developer gets the land, they develop the property, they get the revenues, and hopefully generate some taxes. We're trying to ask, is there something between that and just Whitman Walker having its old building as a liability on its balance sheet?
Dan, we won't ask you if GSA is ready to start doing this.
Brett,
That's a whole other webinar.
Brett, I just want to add that there's a kind of an interesting thought process. When you look at this, some nonprofit leaders that either will read the brief or have been on this and will listen to the recording, they may see the certain parts of this as, oh, this is a pink unicorn, that's unique circumstances or what have you. And I would argue that that's kind of a misread. And upon more reflection, churches, other organizations of faith, universities, hospitals, have been using real estate to be able to supplement their mission from a sustainability perspective for, 150 years now. And so for the nonprofit leaders on this webinar, think not necessarily like this is a pink unicorn or 2 standard deviations away from what we do, because we're not asking you to become developers. We're asking you to think about partnership models where you do what you do. And then really think long and hard about, are there existing models in community or in your region that have worked well? Why did they work? And can that be replicated in your circumstance? And I love the idea that government would start thinking about the same thing with their land and their holdings, which is there's so much more to do in community to strengthen the fabric of who we are. And we've got this untapped asset value, and we need to think creatively about this. I hope this project has helped shed some light on how people might be able to do that in the future.
It's great. Let's spend our last couple of minutes talking about replication and also the infrastructure that's needed for that to happen. Is this just a hot market phenomenon? Can it work in medium and cooler places? Does it just work for properties that are really, really valuable in those markets? You need a lot of governance work on education with the board. You need the developer. How scarce is that every market has a developer? Is there always one to find, or is that hard? How often, is COVID posing a challenge to this, and empty office spaces, or do we have enough other uses? Obviously, that is a little parcel dependent as well. Just help us think ahead to future deals, future markets, other places.
Yeah, that was a lot of questions, but But I think the joke is, if you've done one real estate deal, you've done one real estate deal. So the answer, I guess, is yes or no to all those questions. Probably just maybe. But the bigger idea here is to ask yourself, like, are you asking the right questions? Are you interrogating your assets and looking at your assets as assets and asking yourself, what could they do? What could they do to forward your mission? What could they do to support you financially? What could they do to further your goals within the community? A lot of talk about affordable housing. There is lots of one-story, nonprofit buildings that could be 5-story with four stories of affordable housing on the top and 1 story of the nonprofit on the bottom. Are there ways that you could triple down on your mission by really looking at the assets you have? Someone asked, would this have worked better? Would this work at all if it was a vacant lot? I think it would have been so much easier for Whitman Walker to do it if it was a vacant lot, because there's no historic preservation. They had to save a facade. It's incredible stuff, and it was all good. But a vacant lot would have been way easier if it was a vacant lot at 14th and S. If it's a vacant lot somewhere else, that could be way harder. And the answer is there's no simple answer, but it's worth digging in and really worth exploring, and then worth discussing with your finding creative development partners. There's no shortage of developers anywhere. And then so understanding who has experience, looking at what they did before, seeing if there's alignment of mission and interest and personality. And then speaking with your funders and seeing what level of interest they would have in entertaining a broader investment that's beyond just a traditional operating grant or even a capital grant.
Yeah, Brett, I would just add to Dan's comments from the nonprofit leadership view. This ultimately was a long-term stewardship play. And we found a way to do it to honor the bequests of the gay men that left us their properties, to be able to serve our current patients with updated facilities, and to be able to expand. And we took a really long-term view. Some organizations won't invest 7 to 10 years for the return because they'd rather sell, get the immediate proceeds, and kind of deal with the immediacy. The issue with that is that a sale of a property for 10 or 15 or 20 million looks great. And it's really attractive in the short term. But as Naseema shared, Whitman Walker's 50 years old. It's had 9 different significant financial challenges, to which it's probably burned 40 million in those 9 years, right? 20 million is not a lot of money when you're a nonprofit of mid to large size, and you can go through it pretty quick. And then ultimately the stewardship question becomes, how do we do this in such a way that it honors the mission and advances the mission, but you do it in a really thoughtful, analytic, and kind of business focused way. And I think we were able to capture that. And I think the brief does a really nice job of laying out both benefit and risk. So Brett, thanks to you and your team for that.
Thank you all. I wish we had more time, and sorry, Naseema and Andy, not bringing you back. But we do have the brief, and we have pages of documentation about stakeholders and much more on lessons learned and the finances. And all these folks are around and able to be accessed as well. So thank you. Hopefully this was a bit of inspiration about creative thinking and forward thinking, as well as how to make some investments now, make some decisions now that might take the better part of a decade to pay off, but ultimately really are doing so. So appreciate you all joining the discussion, and look forward to seeing many more of these examples popping up in the years to come. Take care.